All right. So just to introduce the speakers, so we have Marina Niessner. Marina is currently an assistant professor of finance at Indiana University's Kelley Business School. Prior to joining Kelley, she was the Judith C. and William G. Bolliger Visiting Associate Professor of Finance at the University of Pennsylvania's Wharton School. In the past, she also worked as vice president on the global selection team at AQR Capital Management. And as an assistant professor of finance at the Yale School of Management. She holds a BA in economics and statistics and a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. Her academic research has been published in the Journal of Finance and the Review of Financial Studies, among other outlets, as well as featured in the Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal, and also Yahoo Finance. Marina today will discuss her research on the role of social media platforms in finance. She will focus on whether different platforms generate different information signals, as well as whether bad actors and misinformation on social media can affect retail investors and financial markets. So welcome, Marina. Thanks. We also have Alberto Rossi. Alberto is a professor of finance at Georgetown University. He's also the director of AI, Analytics, and Future of Work Initiative at Georgetown, a visiting fellow at Brookings, and a member of the Economic Advisory Committee, EAC, at FINRA. His research interests include fintech, household finance, machine learning, and asset pricing. His recent work studies how robo-advisors can help individual investors make better financial decisions and how to predict stock market returns using machine learning algorithms. So if you want to make money, he's right. He has worked extensively in analyzing big data and has collaborated with major brokerage houses, fintech firms, and asset managers around the world. Professor Rossi's work has been published in leading academic journals such as the Journal of Finance, the Journal of Financial Economics, the Review of Financial Studies, and Management Science, among others. Before Georgetown, Alberto was an associate professor with tenure at the R.H. Smith School of Business at the University of Maryland. He also worked as an economist at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System in Washington, D.C. He received his PhD in economics from the University of California, San Diego. Alberto will be talking about recent advances in social networks and household finance. Welcome, Alberto. Thank you. And third, we have myself. My name is Mohamed Al Guindy. I'm an assistant professor of finance at the Sprott School of Business at Carleton University in Canada. I don't have a piece about myself. But I'll tell you very brief things. So my undergrad was in electrical engineering at the University of Toronto in Canada, followed by a master's in electrical engineering as well at Queen's University in Canada, and then an MBA, and then a PhD in finance at Queen's University, and now I'm an assistant professor at Carleton University. So if you know the map of Canada, I keep moving east a little bit. So I'll be talking about social networks and finance and sort of constructing social networks based on social media discussions. And I'm going to start first, and then Marina will go next, and then Alberto. So we'll start with my presentation, and this work is mostly based on my paper, The Social Internetwork and Stock Returns, co-authored with Ryan Reardon from Queen's University and LMU Munich Business School. And then we'll talk about more advancements in different areas related to this research agenda. So what's the objective? What's the objective of this research or this work? Well, the objective is very simple. The objective is to construct a network representation of the economy based on social media discussions. And in doing so, the goal is to aggregate the wisdom of the crowd generated by hundreds of millions of financial tweets. And here's a sample tweet that we see on the screen. And we know that this is a financial tweet because of the presence of the hashtag symbol or the dollar sign followed by a stock ticker. So here we see dollar sign Tesla, and in the Twitter world, it means that this is a tweet, a financial tweet strictly about the stock of Tesla. Also looking at the same tweet, we see that it is discussing the stock of Apple as well because of the presence of the hashtag symbol or the dollar sign followed by the stock ticker. So based on this financial tweet, we established one link or one connection between the two companies, one connection between Tesla and Apple. But of course, we're not gonna be looking at one tweet or one or two companies. We're looking at a much larger universe of companies and tweets. We're looking at hundreds of millions of financial tweets. So how do we collect this data? Well, it's based on the data has been collected using primarily the Twitter public API. So basically downloading and acquiring all the tweets as they take place. And those of you who are familiar with the Twitter API, at least for a long time, it was the data would appear and disappear quickly. That means you kind of have to capture it quickly before it's gone. And in the world of big data, we call that high velocity data, meaning that the data appears quickly, but also moves and disappears quickly. Hence, it was necessary to collect this data regularly around the clock to make sure we capture the tweets before they are gone. So basically, we set up we had a lab at my university, at Carleton University, the social media and finance lab, and I'll talk a little bit more about it, but that lab had multiple robots that are collecting the tweets around the clock for the last several years. So what do we get? So after aggregating all of these tweets over a long period of time, we establish connections between firms. And one example connection is what we see here between Tesla and Apple. And I think some of you might be thinking, well, that doesn't make very much sense. How are these two companies related in such strong ways as we see here? Well, that's because this network of the economy based on social media discussions appears to capture those deep and non-obvious and intricate links that exist between firms in the economy. So aggregating all of this across all tweets, across all firms, we get what we call the social internetwork. And this social internetwork is basically the representation of the economy based on these social media discussions. And one thing, when we look at these discussions and we look at this network, we observe two things. We find that they tend to identify those networks that are non-obvious, that are not clear, those sort of subtle connections that exist between firms. And that's sort of looking at the topology or the overall structure of these networks and these graphs. A second observation that's not necessarily very obvious is that this works like a network, just like other networks and graphs and so on. These work in the same way, meaning from an economic perspective, whenever we have a shock that takes place at the center of the economy or at the center of these networks, these shocks tend to propagate outwards to the periphery of the economy. On the other hand, any shocks or economic changes that take place at the periphery of the economy, they don't make their way back to the center. They just sort of dissipate and disappear outwards. So that's some important observation about the overall network structure of the economy. And we call this the social internetwork. And it's not necessarily based on the movie, although I was very much inspired by the movie. We just added the internet part at the beginning. But it's basically a network of networks. That's the idea. That's what an internetwork is. It's a network of networks. And the social is because it comes from social media discussions. And the idea is to have this sort of live representation of the economy based on the aggregate opinions of millions of social media users. So what are we going to focus on? Very briefly, we're going to look at two views of the economy. We're going to look at the micro view, in which we look at sort of one firm and its immediate neighbors. How is the relationship between a firm and its immediate neighbors on the social internetwork? And then extend this sort of to the macro view of the economy, in which we look at, well, what about the network structure? What can we learn sort of from the graph theory piece or the network theory of the economy? Because it's such a neat and nice representation. So some terminology here. Most of this is borrowed from graph theory and network theory, and also some of it is relatively specialized. So we identify neighboring firms as firms that happen to be next to each other in the social internetwork, or those that have a direct connection to each other. We also identify peer firms, and that's sort of external to the social internetwork. These are the FAMA French 48 industry peers, companies that are in the same industry, such as Google and Microsoft. And that's going to be important as we start exploring the differences and the similarities between this network and other existing measures and other existing networks that we know quite well. We identify connection as a link, one link or one connection between two firms, and that link or that connection is established when two companies are mentioned in the same tweet. And of course, typically a pair of companies will have a large number of connections, not just one, but multiple links. Central firms are those that happen to be at the center of the economy. Equivalently, they're the ones that are most connected to the rest of the economy or have the largest number of connections to other firms. And finally, peripheral firms are those that happen to be at the periphery of the economy with the least number of connections to other firms in the economy. So looking at the micro view, I wanted to start with this simple graph or looking at Tesla and Tesla's closest neighbors. And I'll give you a second to look at Tesla's closest neighbors. And yes, the closest neighbors are Apple, Nvidia, Amazon, Netflix, and Facebook. None of these are General Motors or Ford or, sort of some of the usual suspects. And that's exactly the first aspect of the social internetwork, that it is able to identify those subtle, those deep and non-obvious links that exist between firms, simply based on the views and the opinions of a large number of investors on social media. I'm sure you still have a lot of questions, but we will answer them soon enough. So looking at direct connections between one firm to the sort of the rest of the economy or to the neighbors. Well, the average number of connections for the average firm, so each firm is connected or has approximately 9,500 links to neighbors. And these links are represented by individual tweets. The total number of connections between a firm and its closest neighbor is about 650. The total number of connections between a firm and its 10 closest neighbors is a little bit over 3,000, and between a firm and its 20 closest neighbors is a little bit over 4,000 links. The mean number of connections between one firm and the rest of the economy, meaning how many other firms, about 660 firms. So each firm is connected directly on the social internetwork to approximately 660 firms. And that represents approximately 17% of the economy. So each firm, on average, is connected to 17% of the economy. So your question so far, you must be thinking, well, okay, fine, that's a nice graph and so on, but how does this make any sense? Like, where's the information coming from? Where is the value coming from? And that's of course, that's the most important question. In fact, the only important question. And we wanted to see, does these networks make any sense? What we did so far, we just captured what we see on social media as the economy as seen by a large number of investors. But does this actually make any economic sense? And to start looking at this, we looked at some basic analysis. We looked at the correlation between a firm's returns and the market, and on average, it's about 0.16. Of course, makes sense. Then we wanted to look at industry peers. So, if you're in a certain industry, what's your correlation in returns with your industry peers? And the value was 0.18, so that's a little bit higher than each firm with the rest of the economy. That makes a lot of sense. We know companies in the same industry tend to be positively correlated, more so than they are correlated with the rest of the economy. And then we wanted to put this social internetwork to the test. What's the correlation in returns between a firm and its 20 closest neighbors? And the correlation is close to 0.25, which is quite significantly higher than the correlation between a firm and its industry peers. So right there, we see some evidence, well, we might be up to something. We might be able to capture something that's a little bit more precise, a little bit more, perhaps possibly accurate than what we have been reflecting or what we have been looking at before. And remember, this is all happening organically. We're not making any assumption about the economy. We're simply capturing the discussions and looking at what we see based on these discussions. So generally, for most of the test, we're looking at a firm and its 20 closest neighbors. We can lower this to 10 or increase to 30. That most of the analysis remains quite similar. And notice here that one of the benefits that we have is that not only do we have connections, but we also have the strength of connection, meaning that we know how many, based on how many connections a firm has with its neighbors, we can tell this is a strong connection or a weak connection. And that makes a lot of difference later on. So looking at some regression analysis, basic regressions, yes, we find a high correlation between a company's returns and the returns of its neighbors, looking at the top 20 closest neighbors. And then my goal is not to focus too much on the regressions, but we also account for industry peers, so we include that in the regression. And of course, the social internetwork has a higher coefficient, and even in the presence of industry peers. Then, just to do a little bit more robustness, we looked at, well, what if we get rid of all the industry peers? Like we construct a second network where each company is not allowed to be a neighbor to anybody in the same industry. So we wanted to build that other network to see what happens. And we got a very similar set of results. So even by excluding all the industry peers, the social internetwork neighbors are very highly correlated. And so that gives us evidence that, well, it appears that these relationships are important, they are real, and they are economically significant. And, we might be wondering, well, why is this coefficient higher? Why is the coefficient higher when we include industry peers versus when we don't? Well, it makes a lot of sense because naturally some of the company's neighbors have to be industry peers. Like we do expect that, but not necessarily and not exclusively. And that's exactly what this tells us. We do a similar analysis with a vector autoregression, and we have similar results. Then we wanted to look at the transmission of information and the transmission of noise, looking at these direct connections. So we're still in the micro view of the economy. Does noise get transmitted on these connections, and does fundamental economic signal get transmitted? And sort of in the interest of time, the answer is yes. There's a very strong relationship in fundamental economic signal measured by earnings surprises. We find that when there is a shock or there's an economic change at a company, it's reflected in its social internetwork neighbors. And surprisingly, looking at industry peers, we didn't see that was the case. Some of these fundamental shocks did not transmit to industry peers, but they did transmit to social internetwork neighbors. Similarly, we document similar events to the transmission of noise. So the social internetwork transmits information, but also noise. You might wonder, well, what does that mean? Well, it means that this network is agnostic. It doesn't care about the signal. It doesn't understand what the signal means. It's simply a set of wires transmitting information from one company to the next because of these connections. So that was the micro view of the economy. We see that there's sort of a relationship between these companies, and this relationship is important and significant even in the presence of peer firms. So now we shift to the macro view of the economy, which is actually my favorite view. We look at these connections and these sort of intricate changes and edges and networks and nodes and so on. And I find that quite exciting, just looking at these networks and sort of analyzing what's going on. And this is a sample cluster of the economy. And there's so many. You can sort of zoom in and look at different parts of the economy and look at all the connections. And I have all of this data available on my website, malguindy.com/internetwork. So I have all of this available, along with centrality measures and all kinds of measures which you might find useful. So that's all with CSV files with all the information as well. And here's a view looking at the year 2021, sort of the 200 most central firms in the economy. And when I looked at this data, so I look at this every year. So every year we build a new network representing the changes for that year. And when I was looking at this one, the most obvious thing I noticed, and you might not be able to see it here, AMC and GameStop, that's the thickest and the strongest connection in the economy in the year 2021. And initially I was upset to see that because I don't believe in the AMC and GameStop idea, but it appears that that's reflected here. And that goes to sort of reinforce the idea that this network captures the pulse of the economy, captures all the opinions of all the people as investors see it. It's not necessarily information or noise. It's just whatever is out there, it's capturing, and it appears to be doing it relatively quickly. So having looked at these networks, I started looking at industry networks as well. So looking at particular industries, and I spent so much time looking at these networks that my wife decided to give me a mug with one of these networks as part of my birthday present. The bar is pretty low for a birthday present for me, but it was a mug with these networks. So anyway, actually, I'll tell you more. And my mother-in-law made a cake. She makes like amazing cakes, and it looked like this. She told me, take the cake to your conferences with you. I was like, no, I can't do that, but thank you very much. So looking at particular industries, which is also possible. So we can look at the whole economy, but we can focus on certain industries. So I wanted to look at, not surprisingly, since I did electrical engineering, the chips or the microelectronics industry. So I looked at 2017, 2018, and 2019. I'm looking at which firms are more central, which firms are sort of more peripheral. So looking at 2019, well, AMD was the most central firm in that industry in 2019. And I was thinking, I thought it would be Intel, like, computers and so on. But, thinking about that industry in 2019, a lot of computer manufacturers were moving from Intel processors to AMD processors. And that also appears to be reflected here, that there's sort of AMD is the most central in the year 2019. Going back to 2018, we see multiple firms at the center of that industry. So NVIDIA, AMD, also Intel, Micron Technologies. There appears to be multiple central nodes in that industry. Going back to 2017, well, it was NVIDIA. NVIDIA was actually at the center of that industry. And thinking about this one, well, 2017 was sort of, I would say, the dawn of the new AI revolution. And NVIDIA is right there at the center of that AI revolution. And that appears to be reflected on these networks and these diagrams as well for that year. So, looking at all of these things, well, it's possible not only to examine static networks, which is what we have been doing so far, but what's next? We want to look at dynamic networks. Well, what happens if we, look at the economy, look at the evolution, the movement of the economy, the changes in clusters? Well, what happens if a new company comes in? What happens to the rest of the cluster? How does it reform? If a company exits, what happens to all the connections? Do they get stronger? Do they get weaker? So we want to understand all of these changes and all of these dynamics in the network. And I think that's computationally, that's extremely demanding. So, building one of these networks on a relatively powerful computer takes about 2 weeks for each year, for each network. So it's not humanly possible to do dynamic networks, but luckily what we're going to be working on next, recently I just won a Canadian Foundation of Innovation. So I want to give credit to the CFI Foundation, which is a research funding institute in Canada. They decided to give me, well, it wasn't as simple as that, but they're going to give me an NVIDIA DGX A100 supercomputer. So it's an AI supercomputer that's going to be doing all of these things. That's going to be analyzing all the networks and all the evolution and the changes in a dynamic fashion. So I'm really looking forward to this and sort of starting to explore the dynamic networks and in financial markets based on this simple idea of the social internetwork and the wisdom of the crowd. Then wanted to look at, I should probably finish in the next minute or two, looking at changes or economic changes or economic shocks. Well, whenever anything happens at the center, it tends to propagate outwards to the periphery. On the other hand, anything that happens at the periphery simply disappears and dies away. And I have a lot of analysis to support this idea. And then finally, maybe one of the last points I want to talk about, and this was not so much related to finance, but related to Shakespeare. So this line in Hamlet by Polonius, which is also on the same mug, by the way. That line is on the same mug. By indirections, we find directions out. That's a line for Polonius, that through indirect ways we can find the direct answer, or the direct solution. And literally, it was inspired by this line, this idea of looking at second-order networks. So here we have, firm A and B are connected directly, B and C are connected directly, but A and C are not. These companies are not connected directly. However, there's an indirect connection between these two companies, hence the indirection. So the goal of this analysis is to look at, second-order networks. What if we look at indirect connections, one firm to another through an intermediary firm? And you might be wondering, that sounds like fun, but what's the value? What's the economic value of this? And there has to be an economic value. And the economic value was was that we're able to achieve greater coverage of the economy. So remember, one of the early slides, I said that each firm is connected to 17% of the economy directly. Well, now with these second-order networks, we achieve a connection, rate or density or coverage rate of 92%, meaning each company is connected to 92% of the economy. So that's quite impressive because, we achieve greater coverage in ways that were not possible before. So previous measures or network measures, typically each company is connected to a small number of firms, maybe in the 5 or 10% range. Even the basic social internetwork is 17%. But going to these second order networks, we're looking at 92% coverage. And, that took a lot of computational power, and so sort of left it there. But it's also possible to extend to third and fourth order networks and capture more connections, a sort of more subtle and more, delicate connections that exist between firms. And reproducing all the analysis, the results are quite similar. In fact, they're even a little bit stronger when looking at second-order networks. So finally, the goal of this work has been to look at the micro view of the economy, looking at the transmission of information and noise, and sort of build this large network of the economy and look at the transmission of shocks. So that's everything I have right now. Maybe we'll do some questions at the end of the panel. And thank you so much for your attention. And Thank you. And Marina is up next. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming to the session. So I will talk today about social media and finance. So my work is much less computationally fancy than most. I do all my work on my computer, but my laptop. But I want to talk a little bit kind of more social media a little bit more directly. So what impact does kind of existence of social media has on financial markets, what information we can get from it, and what the quality of that information is. So I want to start a little bit with an overview. Why are we even thinking about social media? I mean, on the one hand, you can clearly get some very useful information from it, but more generally, sort of as society or as investors, so first of all, as you probably know, I don't know if you do, but a lot of Americans, a lot of people spend a lot of time on social media. It's also becoming primarily one of the main sources of news for people, definitely sort of world news, thank you, but can also financial news. And now more and more firms also disclose information and communicate with investors using social media. And obviously, since the GME episode, even though I also don't like the fact that it happened, it has sort of put social media more in the forefront in the financial markets. When I worked at a hedge fund, which was pre-2021, sort of my research on social media didn't matter that much. People tried using some signals, but obviously since 2021, since we saw that retail investors can affect financial markets, it's become a much more important part of financial markets and also of academic research. So the number of papers I referee has gone up a lot since 2019, let's say. And obviously, there are two sides to each coin. And so there are two kind of, I think, good and potentially not so good parts of social media. So on the one hand, obviously social media has really changed the way not only how we consume, but also how we produce information. So until kind of social media took off, production of information in financial markets was limited to journalists, to analysts, or maybe institutional investors. Now anybody can sort of produce information. So there's been this idea of democratization of information production, which we think is probably a good thing. On the other hand, it obviously, and it's been a lot in the news, it offers a lot of opportunities to sort of misinformation or producing some misleading information. And so, in terms of just a brief overview, at least the way I see the area, there's been these are some recent developments in the social media academic research, and I'm citing some papers. There are many, many more papers out there. So if your paper is not cited here, I apologize. These are sort of some examples. But I think one area where there's been a lot of research and progress is information on social media, and it's been from several angles. One has been actually how do you extract information from social media? So there's been progress on sort of sentiment extraction, because for a long time we were using sort of Lawford and McDonald's dictionary, and people realize it doesn't work well when you have messages that are like 2 words long and half of them are misspelled. So there have been sort of Vader, then there have been some papers right here that looked at emojis. People have been looking at GIFs because a lot of social media posts don't actually have words. They might have images or videos. So there's been progress in that. And also, just what type of information do we actually, like if you measure that sentiment, does that predict financial markets? Does it predict returns? How does it affect financial markets? So that's been kind of one area. And I will talk a little bit, so I'll talk about several of my papers today. So I will talk about this paper briefly. It kind of tries to summarize a little bit what information we're actually getting from different platforms. Then another, like, conditional on kind of extracting this information, what is the quality of this information? And there have been papers trying to look at, well, that will be kind of the second point that I'll talk about. Is there false information on there? Does it affect financial markets? Do investors get good, bad advice from social media? So there'll be another area I'll talk about. And then there's also been research, more research on the direct effect of social media on real outcomes. Several co-authors of mine have a recent paper that social media might have affected bank runs. So not just sort of not just trading, but actual real outcomes, like influences managements or influences depositors, etc. And one area that there might have been, I haven't seen papers in this area yet, but I think they're definitely coming, and maybe they're already out there. I just haven't seen them. I definitely think that AI, like things like ChatGPT, are going to influence how social media is consumed. First of all, there's already a paper that looks at using ChatGPT for news, for sentiment classification of news stories. I'm sure there'll be one soon about classifying sentiment on social media, but also how it's produced. Because we've talked about bots, etc., but now if you have things like ChatGPT producing fake or fraudulent information, I think that might take on a whole new level. Again, I haven't seen research in that, but I'm hoping to maybe write some, and it would be awesome if some other people did as well. Okay, so that's kind of the broad overview from my end of social media and finance. And I want to talk, as I mentioned, about 2 topics and covering 3 papers. So one is talking a little bit about information on social media. And I want to talk about my paper with co-authors, The Social Signal. I'm only going to give you guys a very broad overview because my wonderful co-author, Runjing, is actually going to present this paper at 9 a.m. tomorrow in the social media and investment session. So if you want to hear more details, go to that session. But I just want to, I think this is an important paper to talk about in the context of social media, so I want to give you a little bit of a flavor of this paper. So the motivation was, as I mentioned, the number of papers about social media and finance academic papers has skyrocketed in the past couple of years. And often, sometimes they come to conflicting conclusions. And often they draw conclusions, including my own research, about social media more generally, but often using one particular platform for obvious reasons, for data availability. So I have papers using stock tweets. People have papers using Twitter. I have a paper using Seeking Alpha. And so the question is, well, what information are we actually getting from these platforms? Because these platforms are quite different. They often have different user population. They do have different incentives for people to contribute. They have different timing, different formats. And so the question is, do we get, so is the research kind of using individual platforms connected? Can we draw the same conclusion from all the papers, regardless of which platform they use? Or are there sort of some caveats to that? So basically the idea is, are all these, put it in graphics, is there kind of this monolith view? Are all these platforms basically substitutes? Or are all these platforms kind of complements, in the sense of, like the fable about the elephant? Does each platform give us a little bit of a flavor of social media? And to really get a sense of social media more broadly, for example, to answer, does social media predict stock returns or things like that, do we actually need to look at all the platforms? And so I will, as I mentioned, I'm just going to summarize our findings. And then for the details, if you're interested, go to Rinching's session. So what we do is when we talk about social media signal, what does that even mean? So when we look using like principal component analysis, we find that there are actually two separate signals. One is sentiment, so are investors bullish or bearish on a particular stock? And one is attention. Attention meaning, we define it slightly different because we normalize things in the paper, but just imagine sort of number of messages. So how much are people talking about a particular stock on a given day versus what is their sentiment about that stock? And so what we find is that attention is sort of common across platforms. So when people talk about a particular stock on Twitter, they also talk about that stock on Stock Tweets, and they also talk about that stock on Seeking Alpha. However, sentiment is more idiosyncratic. So the sentiment across platforms actually has a very low correlation. And obviously you could say, well, so we try to make sure it's not driven by different NLP like methods or things like that. So after controlling for a lot of things, we show that the sentiment has a fairly low correlation. There's also heterogeneity in coverage, it turns out, by firm size. So Stock Tweets focuses a lot more on sort of micro caps or small companies, and Twitter and Seeking Alpha focus more on larger firms. So it could be depending on what type of firms you want to analyze, you may want to go to different platforms. We also find more generally sentiment seems to predict returns positively for like next day. So there seems to be across these platforms actual information for next day returns when you control for a lot of other things. However, attention has actually negative predictability. So, I mean, maybe not surprising if you think about what type of investors might trade based on social media signals. But when people are very, very excited about a particular stock, that actually has negative return implications in the future. And we look at two sort of natural experiments. Obviously, we don't have a complete exogenous variation, but trying to understand what could be driving differences, for example, in sentiment across these platforms or informativeness. And so we use two, as I mentioned, two experiments. One is Stock Tweets, somewhat exogenously, increased their character limit from, I think, 180 to 1,000 in 2019. And so we showed that that actually improves information on Stock Tweets, meaning the return for stability gets better. And it's partially driven by the types of investors that are attracted to the possibility of being able to write longer messages. But that shows that just changing a feature of the platform, and as I mentioned, all these platforms have different features, can actually change what type of information you're getting out of it. And also we use the January 2021 GME event, sort of the fact that there were obviously a lot of big changes in social media and financial markets around that time. And we showed that it actually increases the noise. So depending what time period you're looking at, it actually reduces information on or informativeness of all platforms in particular, which is driven by the types of users that are joining around that time. So again, kind of this paper tries to this is just a broad overview of the paper trying to get a little bit of housekeeping in this area, given how many papers with different platforms we now have. I will stop here with this paper, and again, tomorrow you'll hear more details if you're interested. So what I want to talk about next, given that we are getting this information from social media, what is the quality of information? Like, what types of potential problematic information could we be getting? And so the two papers I want to quickly talk about are very different in their stages. The first paper I literally presented, and we don't even have a full working draft yet, and the other one is already published. So the first one is about what type of, so it's here. So there's been a lot of actors that have lots and lots of followers and influence on social media that have been writing tweets that look like financial advice. And so we wanted to understand what type of financial advice are these people actually producing. And you might, depending how closely you follow the news, you might have sort of heard about some of these people sort of getting in trouble with their promotions. So this is joint work with Matteo, Will, and Jan. And we're particularly focusing on cryptocurrencies, and my other paper is going to be about stocks, because cryptocurrencies are obviously quite unregulated, and so social media seems like a perfect opportunity to talk about cryptocurrencies. Or potentially give some advice. And also, these are surveys by Nork from University of Chicago and Betterment, where they ask people where they get their financial advice, where they go for financial advice. And so for stocks, people said about 7% said they get it from social media, or I guess is their primary source, and 38% said they actually go to financial advisor. Whereas when you look at cryptocurrencies, 24% said they go to social media for their primary financial advice, and only 2% said they go to broker and advisors. Crypto exchanges and trading platforms, the way I understand the survey, are like Binance Academy, for example, where there might be some information about cryptocurrencies, but about a quarter of them say their primary source of financial advice for cryptocurrencies is social media. So that seems like a good area to look at what type of advice are they actually getting. And there's been, as I mentioned, because maybe due to lack of regulation, there have been a lot of real-life celebrities giving what looks like financial advice. Some of it more brazen, maybe. So Kim Kardashian was one of the kind of more recent examples, and she got in trouble for this with the SEC. So this was actually on Instagram. This is what she said. Are you guys into crypto? This is not financial advice, but sharing what my friends just told me about the Ethereum Max token. By the way, it has nothing to do with Ethereum. A few minutes ago, Ethereum Max burned 400 trillion tokens, literally 50% of their admin wallet, giving back to the entire Emacs community. I'm sure she has no idea what these words mean. And she did say hashtag ad at the end. So the regulators didn't think this was funny or sufficient. But what is the problem with this? The problem is, so the Financial Conduct Authority in Britain called it as the financial promotion with the single biggest audience reach in history. And why do they say that? Well, Kim Kardashian has 364 million followers. That's 1 in 15 people in the world who have access to the internet follow Kim Kardashian. If you think about financial advisors and how much research we have about them and their incentives, they have a fraction of this reach, right? And so, the SEC didn't like this promotion, so they settled eventually. But you might say, okay, it's Kim Kardashian. Are you actually going to follow Kim Kardashian's advice on cryptocurrencies? Hopefully nobody in this room will, but this is from the SEC lawsuit. A striking 19% of respondents who said they heard about the post invested in Ethereum Max as a result. So there's a huge conversion rate. And so what we do in the paper, we obviously don't have the whole paper just about this one post. We look at, so do investors see these posts as financial advice? So do we see any evidence besides just the survey that people actually follow this financial advice? And we try to understand what is the quality of financial advice, especially kind of what is compared to a counterfactual, because again, given that there's sort of lack of maybe financial advisor type sources for these investors, like how are they doing following this advice? So our data is, let's see how we're doing. We collect data from 75 real world celebrities. We collect all their crypto related tweets. Just to give you some examples of the type of people there are. So Russell Okung, Mark Cuban, Justin Bieber, Paris Hilton. You can see they have like tons and tons. So this is on Twitter now. They have lots of followers. So the average number of followers in our data is 10 million people. I think the median is about 5. So these are people with a lot of followers. But the important thing is most of you will probably have heard about most of these people, but probably not for their sort of financial knowledge. We all know them, but not because there's some financial gurus. And just show you some examples of these tweets. So at least Kim Kardashian, it looked like an ad. She even said hashtag ad. Here, Reese Witherspoon says, just bought my first Ethereum. Let's do this. Jake Paul said, now I'm talking about Yummy. A year ago, I talked about Doge before Elon. Apparently, Paris Hilton loves Bitcoin. Bitcoin as collateral makes credit scores a thing of the, right? Like, so these are people who I mean, this is mind-boggling, but I never would think have any financial sort of expertise are very openly, and it doesn't look like financial advice. They're just saying what they're doing. And the question is, do people actually follow this? And we have two types of data to show that they do. One is actually the survey that the SEC cited in their lawsuit. So my co-author Matteo is Italian, and he called up the lady who did the survey and schmoozed her, and apparently we just got the whole underlying raw survey data. And obviously there are caveats with surveys. Are people really doing what they're saying they're doing? And we have another data set to confirm that these results seem to actually hold. So here they were surveyed. I'll show you the survey because it actually has some interesting results. So there are 2,200 adults that were surveyed around this kind of Kim Kardashian promotion. And so first of all, here's a regression. On the left-hand side is, do you own crypto? And we see that 17% of respondents own crypto, which is actually fairly representative. Like NORC conducted a survey and they found about, I think, 13% own crypto. So actually a lot of Americans nowadays do own crypto. We can see that maybe not surprisingly, they're more likely to be male, slightly younger. And this is actually important, and I'll show you a thing in a second. Actually, crypto is held more by underrepresented minorities, which is probably quite unfortunate, I think. Partially because, not surprisingly, they feel that they're being sort of disadvantaged in the real estate markets and the Wall Street market. And so here they feel like they finally have equal footing. So I think it's especially important to study because this is actually not just the survey. So we see that 18% saw the Ethereum max post by Kim Kardashian. And again, they're more likely to be men, younger, etc. And then here focusing on people that saw it. So we have 399 people. So we're losing power here. About 19%, that's what the SEC cited, had actually invested after seeing the post. And again, we can see that men were more likely to do it, younger people. Luckily, I mean, we're really losing power here, but it doesn't look like the minorities are more likely to do it. But a lot of people did follow up on this. And again, so this is a survey. We have also, this is where our co-author Jan comes in. We have a data set from a company, from a fintech company that does kind of budgeting for people, where you connect your checking account and your credit cards to them. So we see every single transaction on the checking accounts, and we can see when people move money to things like, Coinbase, or FTX US and things like that. So crypto exchanges. And so we see on the days when, so I'm not going to show you the same table and just say, look, the results look the same, but we see that on days when these tweets come out, the number of people or the amount of investing in cryptos goes up by about 10%. And it's both on the extensive and the intensive margin that we see new investors coming in, and also the existing crypto investing and investors investing more money. So people, again, we can back it up with with the trading data that this is not just a fluke. Let me skip this. So then we look at, well, what type of advice do they getting, and can we maybe see a little bit from a different angle whether people are actually trading based on this? So here we have hourly data. Right now we only have it for 5 coins: Bitcoin, Ethereum, Cardano, Ripple, and Doge. The nice thing is these are huge established coins. So they're not like Yummy or something like toy coins. There's tons of trading volume in this. So in theory, you shouldn't see much here. It's like trying to move Apple's price. But what we actually, so this is hourly trading volume relative to the tweet. So tweet is right here. And we can see that, so there's definitely a spike that goes up right after the tweet. So people are definitely trading based on the tweet and then stays for about 12 hours. There's also, it looks like some movement before the tweet. We're not going to say, it could be front running. It could be something else. We don't know. And so what we do is we're trying to understand how have you done financially if you invested relative to before the tweet versus after the tweet. So if you bought 12 hours, 6 hours, 2 hours before, or an hour, 2, 6 hours after. And obviously we don't know when investors sell, so we'll look at just different selling possibilities. And just to show you one, so again, this is very fresh work, very much work in progress. It's fresh off the press. Just so here are returns. So you can see if you bought 12 hours before, and I'm just holding one selling point constant. Your return would have been 1.43%. And you can see it kind of goes down, down, down. The later you buy, the worse off you are. So if you could have front run this, you would have made good money. But you still make some money. I mean, during this time, during like 2021, things were doing great. Cryptos were just going up. So the question is what is the counterfactual? So we look at a counterfactual, which is, and I'll show you a summary in a second. I know there are a lot of numbers here. Let's say you would have just randomly bought 2 weeks earlier, but at exactly the same day of the week, exactly the same time. Because I have worked a lot on crypto retail investors. They sometimes trade what look like almost randomly. So let's say you would have just randomly traded. How would you have done? And what we actually see, so this is a placebo tweet just earlier. And what we see, so if you compare buying before or after the tweet, and obviously if you're a retail investor, you're going to be buying after. So around the tweet, your average return in the pre-period is 0.89%. In the post-period is 0.16%. Versus your counterfactual at random sort of time periods, the pre-period is a lower return and the post-period is a higher return. So had you traded randomly, and again, unless you have some insider information and you can front run the tweet, you're better off basically trading randomly than following the celebrities. Maybe not surprising, but I think it's important to document. And again, we're still looking at this whole pre-tweet, what's happening there. Okay, given my timing, I'm going to, and we do this more broadly, so you can see that. Given my timing, I'm going to say one more thing to finish up. So I'm not going to talk about my fake newspaper, but it's already published anyway. So what is the conclusion? So, there's also a paper showing that fake news affects financial markets, maybe not surprisingly. So what can we do? So potential policy implication. So it looks like my other paper actually shows that if you warn people that there's fraudulent information on these websites, people seem to react to that. Even though they somehow know it, probably deep inside, if you remind them of it, they seem to sort of take that more into account. So this is, when I was in Germany last summer, this is an ad for eToro, where the guy is selling how much money he's making and that everybody should join eToro, etc. And what I noticed that at the bottom, I apologize, it's in German, but it says 68% of all small investors that invest with eToro lose money. So in the European Union, you actually have to provide a disclosure like that. So one potential policy implication of kind of this fake news research is that potentially we could, maybe with Kim Kardashian and people like that, maybe they should have to provide some warning, or the SEC can suggest that we provide warnings on social media for retail investors, that they should be careful. Okay, I'm, I think, over time, so thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me to come and talk at this wonderful panel. We're going to switch gear a little bit. We're going to get into the effect of peer effects and social finance in trying to see how it can affect individuals' decisions when it comes to their consumption and saving choices, for example. But before that, and just to connect it to how this relates to robo-advice, let me just have a couple of slides ranting about robo-advice and why I think that most of the time people perceive robo-advice in an incorrect fashion. So whenever I talk about robo-advice to people either in academia or outside, I have that the common perception is that people think immediately about Betterment, Wealthfront, Vanguard, Personal Capital. So these are all the robo-advisors that have been or that are trying to help individuals make better investment decisions, right? So instead of hiring a human financial advisor, you can go to a robo-advisor that can help you make kind of better investment decisions for your kind of IRA or for your taxable accounts. Now, but if you think about it, households' decisions are way more complex, right? So if you think about a household as a firm, you're going to have assets and liabilities. People will have to decide how to invest their financial assets, which is what the traditional robo-advisors do. But they will also have to think about how to kind of manage their durable assets. So what cars to buy, what housing to have. And they're going to have to manage their liabilities. So they're going to have to choose what mortgages choice to make, what credit card choices to make, and what kind of student loans to adopt and how to repay them. And there is a bigger and bigger emphasis now, both in industry and in academia, in trying to understand how we can automate these decisions, right? How can we help people make these decisions in a better way using simple automation? So I have a number of papers in this area. So I have a number of papers that are trying to analyze how robo-advising can help individuals making better investment decisions. But I also have some work here, and I'm going to be talking about some work from this set of papers at the bottom of the slide, where what we're trying to do with my co-author is trying to understand how we can use robo-advising in fintech to help people make better consumption, saving, debt, and lending decision. And I think this is where kind of the topic of today comes into play, because the paper I'm going to talk to you a little bit about is going to be how can we use social finance to help people make better consumption decisions and help them save more when it comes to their saving and checking account. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about this paper here with Francesco and Michael Weber. And in a nutshell, what we're trying to do here is trying to understand, in the context of helping people making better consumption saving choice, we know that even for expert economists, it's actually very hard to do, right? Kind of solving the optimal consumption and saving rate for individuals is very difficult. But there are kind of tools out there that are helping individuals making the better decisions using big data, wisdom of the crowd, and providing them with a rule of thumb. So this is what I'm going to be talking about today. So this paper is crowdsourcing peer information and change spending behavior with, once again, Francesco and Michael. And the motivation for this work is that we know that low savings rate is a huge problem in terms of wealth accumulation for retirement. Households have very little understanding about what should be their optimal saving rate. And most of the time, you can imagine them trying to acquire this information from the spending of others, right? So this kind of raises the potential role for the so-called visibility bias that was raised by Hahn, Hirschleifer, and Walden for the first time in 2018. The idea here is very simple. Suppose I want to decide how much to consume. One thing I can do is to just look at my neighbor. Of course, I'm not going to see the entirety of the consumption of my neighbor. I may just see the very fancy Mercedes that they have in the driveway, and then I may not see how much they spend on their groceries when they go to Costco or Whole Foods and so on and so forth. So there may be that option, or what may happen is that individuals will tend to overestimate the spending of the others, and this may be particularly true in times of social media. Just to make it a little bit more vivid, if you were to go on Michael's Instagram account, you would see him sipping champagne on his apartment, but you would not see that most of the days he's working until midnight and having some bratwurst and salad for the next day, right? So we know that biased inference can lead to severe overconsumption. The question is, how can we help people make better choices? Now, in principle, what we would want to do is to provide the individual with the overall spending of others, of people that are similar to them. This is very difficult to do in the context of traditional tools, but this is something that we can do more and more easily using fintech tools. And this is exactly what we're going to be doing in this paper. So we're going to be working with an app that is called Status Money. This is an app that is very similar to, for example, Mint.com. So it's an aggregator. So if you connect all your accounts, it will tell you what is your net worth. It will tell you how much you're spending across the different categories. What is the appealing part of this app is that it will provide individuals with peer information. So it calculates and it kind of takes a set of individuals that are similar to you. It then gives you the information regarding your consumption and your spending across the different categories and benchmarks against people that are similar to you. And so in a nutshell, what we're trying to do in this paper is trying to understand how much do people react to this information and in what way do they do it. And I think also it gives us a very nice setting where we can study peer effects, where you can see people that are similar to each other, but we do not have common shocks, for example, or the role of socialization when it comes to the information we provide. Now, in a nutshell, if you plan on falling asleep, this is the only picture that you need to remember. What we do here is we do a bin scatter of the 20,000 people we have analyzed on the app. What you see is two things. We have this zero, and to the right of the zero, you have all the people that before signing up for the app were overspending compared to their peers. to the left of the zero, instead, you see the people that are underspending compared to their peers. What you'll notice is a couple of things. What you'll see is that people tend to react to this peer information. So people that are overspending, they decrease dramatically their spending after signing up for the app. Those people that instead are underspending, if anything, they increase a little bit their spending, but not by much. You're going to see that there's going to be kind of this very strong monotonic pattern, and there's going to be this very much of an asymmetric pattern. Now, in the rest of the paper, what we show is that the reaction is stronger the more informative is the signal. We're going to find that individuals that have lower income react more to this piece of information. And now one of the kind of concern we have at the outset of this paper was that, well, this may be a selected population. People that decide to sign up for an app like Status may be overly reactive to this peer information exactly because and that's why they sign up for the app. So we have a randomized controlled trial on a non-selected population to see whether the underlying mechanism is pervasive across the broader population. Now, but let me take a step back and drive you a little bit through the details of the app. So if you were to sign up for the app, what you would have to do is to enter your annual income that would be verified by the inflows into your accounts, your age, your home ownership status, your location type, and your social security number. And then you would gonna link all your accounts, your checking accounts, your saving accounts, your investment account, your retirement accounts, your your mortgages, and so on and so forth. On the basis of this information, the app constructs for you a peer group. So in this case, for example, I have an individual that is 42 years old, makes $140,000, lives in New York City, has a credit score of 769. The peer group that is created by the app is going to comprise people between 40 and 50 years of age. It's going to have people that are going to have income ranging 1 to 150 and going to have a credit score ranging from 720 to 780. And you can see also here, it tells me how many people are part of this peer group. Now, the way the peer group are constructed is that for every person, a peer group is going to be designed on the basis of the characteristics I mentioned before, subject to the constraint that there are at least 5,000 people in the peer group. Now, the peer information is kind of collected from a random sample of individuals, so not other people from the app. And so the kind of interesting part of the app is that in a very vivid fashion, what the app does is compare the consumption of each individual to the one of their peers. How does it do it? In a very simple graph. Like, for example, here what I have is the consumption over the month of October. The blue line is the investors. So this is from October 1st all the way to October 30th. You can see that this is how much this person was spending. It's actually spent a ton of money, $17,000 on that month. You're going to have that the peer spent $8,600 and the national average was $4,200. And then you also have information regarding the average income of the person. What kind of individual? So this is going to be kind of the most of the information we're going to be working with and trying to understand how much people are over-consuming or under-consuming compared to their peers. What kind of people are we dealing with? Well, we're dealing with people that are relatively young, 32 years of age. They have credit scores in the 730s. They are actually relatively kind of well off when it comes to the annual income. So it's approximately $92,000. And this is an app that they use relatively extensively. You can see by how much they spend. They approximately spend $5,000 a month when it comes to their expenses. People are spread out all over the U.S. This, I'm just plotting the IP addresses of these individuals that you can see replicate pretty much the map of the United States. And in terms of the baseline results we're going to be working with, we're going to start with doing, and here, given that I have not too much time, I'm going to keep it quite tight. I'm going to show you kind of most of the visual results. We're going to study the change in spending behavior around sign up. We're going to work with the 3 months prior and the 3 months after the sign up. We're going to split individuals from those that are below the peers and above the peers, and we're going to seasonally adjust the spending because, of course, we know that individuals will spend more around Christmas time compared to other periods, for example. So once again, this is the main results we have. Those people that are overspending at the time of sign up, they tend to cut their consumption significantly. The ones that instead are underspending, they leave their consumption pretty much unchanged, or if anything, they increase their consumption a little bit. One thing that you may be concerned is that, well, you're placing this threshold at 0, and maybe you're just fooling me, right? So it may be that the change in shape is actually not happening at 0. It may be that this is artificially determined by the threshold I'm imposing. But we can do something that is a procedure that were developed by Hansen in 2000. They're called endogenous threshold regression. What we try to do here is to fit a kind of linear spline that have one single node, where the node is determined endogenously. And you can see that the threshold is pretty much at the 0 line, and we cannot reject the node that the threshold is at a point different from 0. We can also do kink regressions, where we don't have we impose the kind of having that the two splines are connected to each other. Now, one of the crucial aspects for us was to try to understand where is this change in spending coming from. So what we do is we split the consumption patterns between discretionary spending and non-discretionary spending, where the non-discretionary spending are all the bills, rent, all the aspects that you can't really change. And then the discretionary spending instead are the ones where you have much more maneuverability, like restaurants, eating out, and so on and so forth. And you can see that the entirety of the effect come from changes in discretionary spending. Now, most of the results I show you is kind of short term. We can extend and try to see what happens as we increase the horizon. Of course, we're going to cut the sample dramatically, but we have that the effect seems to be long term, and they don't seem to be mean reverting. Now, one of the main concern we had when it came to these results is that, of course, you may be concerned by the fact that some of these changes may be endogenous. In particular, you may say that, maybe some people are going to be signing up for status money knowing that they are overspending or underspending. And they may have changed the spending anyway, right? The same way I may sign up for a diet knowing that I'm overweight or underweight, and I'm going to change my path no matter what kind of diet I pick. Luckily, what we have is that we can exploit an identification strategy. Here, what we're going to do is exploiting the cutoffs used to assign consumers to their various peers. If you remember from one of the previous slides I had, is that the interesting part about many of these fintech apps is that you tend to have that they bucket people in different categories using some very coarse categories. And so what we can do is, for example, using the income cutoffs, we know that the app uses income cutoffs at $35, $50, $75, $100, and $150,000. And so what will happen is that if you sign up for the app and you tell me that you make $151,000 a year in income, you're going to be bucketed with people that consume much more compared to those people that instead are telling me that their income is 149. Because in the latter case, you're going to be assigned to a group that has income that is 150 or above, and in the other case, you're going to have individuals that instead have an income between 100 and 150. And so what we can do is repeat the results and basically find that everything we find in the baseline results get confirmed in this identified setting. And of course, this reduces the sample quite dramatically, but just gives us more confidence in the fact that this peer information is truly causally related to the change in spending behavior. Then we have a number of additional exercises trying to understand whether the type of information is and the informativeness of the signal makes a difference. So what we do find is that people react more if the peer groups comprise more similar people, if the peer group contains more people, if the income width is smaller, and also if people are unlikely to be able to acquire peer information before adopting the app. Now, one of the big problem we have when it comes to this type of work, of course, is that you may be concerned that maybe these people are not representative of the overall U.S. population, exactly because they are the ones that are signing up for a status app. They are going to be the ones that are more reactive to peer information. So what we do is we try to assess whether this mechanism is externally valid. So we do a RCT on mTurk. So what we do is we go to people and we tell them, look, you now have, suppose you are you receive a $1,000 rebate from the government. How much would you spend out of that in your next month? And then we tell them what people that are similar to them, so their peers, actually would do. And then what we observe is exactly the same. Those people that tell us before seeing the peer information that they would spend a lot of this rebate, after seeing that they are overspending compared to their peers, they kind of adjust it down. And instead, the ones that instead are underspending of this rebate compared to what their peers done, they tend to instead increase it. So this is kind of our way to try and understand whether this effect can be replicable across the broader population. Now, just to conclude, I think that what we do in this work is try to understand how much we can use social finance and peer information to help people make better decisions. What we do find is that the stronger the signal, or the more informative the signal, the stronger the reaction. Now, one caveat we want to highlight here is that reacting to this information is by no means optimal. So it may be like, suppose you are in a world where you are matched to a peer group of individuals that are making disastrous decisions when it comes to their finances, you're going to tend towards them, right? So this is kind of a potentially a tool or a lever that have some promise in helping people, or it can guide people, but of course should be thought very carefully when it comes to broader implementation, because it can have perverse effects. Well, thank you so much for your attention.